The fastest machines ever built for a quarter mile of asphalt have a dirty secret buried inside their history. And it starts with a man lying in a hospital bed, missing part of his foot, staring at the ceiling and deciding he was going to change everything. In motorsport, we love to talk about speed records and championship wins, but the most important moment in drag racing history didn't happen at the finish line. It happened in a Long Beach emergency room in March of 1970, when Don Garlits made a decision that would rewrite the engineering rulebook for an entire sport. Before we get into what happened that day, I need to ask you something. When was the last time you watched a modern top-fuel dragster launch off the line? That long, pointed nose, the driver sitting up front, the engine screaming behind them, and actually wondered why it looks the way it does? Because here is the thing. That shape, that specific configuration, that entire design philosophy that every single professional dragster on Earth follows today, it didn't come from a factory or a committee or a team of engineers with PhDs. It came from one man's catastrophic injury and his furious, methodical, almost stubborn refusal to let that injury be the end of his story. This is Motorsport Heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about the moments where mechanical failure and human determination collide to change sporting history forever. If you're someone who wants to understand not just how motorsport works but why it evolved the way it did, the engineering decisions, the safety breakthroughs, the personalities who dragged entire sports into better versions of themselves, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, to understand what happened to Don Garlits on that March afternoon in 1970, you need to understand what drag racing actually looked like in the years leading up to it, because the sport in that era was a completely different animal from what we watch today. Drag racing had grown out of illegal street racing culture in Southern California during the 1940s. Young men, mostly veterans who had come back from World War II with mechanical skills and restless energy, started racing their modified cars on dry lake beds and eventually on abandoned airstrips. The National Hot Rod Association was founded in 1951 specifically to bring some structure and safety to what was otherwise organized chaos on public roads. By the late 1950s and through the 1960s, top-fuel dragsters had become the pinnacle of the sport, and the people who drove them were genuine celebrities in American motorsport culture. Here's what most people don't realize about those early top-fuel machines. The design that everyone used, that everyone had always used, placed the engine directly in front of the driver. Not beside him, not behind him, right there in front of his face. The supercharged Hemi engine sat at the nose of the car, with the clutch assembly and transmission immediately behind it, and the driver positioned behind all of that mechanical complexity, essentially strapped to a long aluminum tube with wheels. If you think about it from a purely intuitive standpoint, it actually makes sense. You put the heavy stuff at the front, the driver in the middle for some protection, the rear wheels doing the work. Engineers had been building cars this way for decades, and the accumulated knowledge about how to tune and optimize that layout was enormous. Every crew chief, every chassis builder, every driver in the sport understood front-engine dragsters at a cellular level. But the fuel these engines ran on changed the entire risk calculation. And this is where it gets really interesting. Top-fuel dragsters in 1970 didn't run on gasoline. They ran on nitromethane, a compound that looks a bit like water, smells absolutely terrible, and contains oxygen molecules within its own chemical structure. What that means in practice is that an engine running on nitromethane doesn't need as much outside air to combust the fuel, which allows you to push far more of it into the cylinders than would ever be possible with gasoline. The power output numbers were genuinely shocking for the era. According to NHRA historical records, top fuel engines of that period were producing somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 horsepower in a car that weighed around 1,200 pounds fully fueled. For comparison, the most powerful production muscle cars of that same era, the 426 Hemi Dodge Charger, the LS6 Chevelle, the Boss 429 Mustang, were making somewhere between 400 and 450 horsepower in cars that weighed 3,500 pounds. These dragsters were operating in a completely different dimension of power-to-weight ratio. And all of that force, every single bit of those 2,000 horsepower, had to pass through the clutch. Now, You might be thinking of the clutch as this simple mechanical component, the thing your left foot interacts with when you're learning to drive a manual transmission vehicle. But the clutch in a top-fuel dragster is something else entirely. It's a multi-disc assembly the size of a dinner plate, engineered to slip and engage progressively across the quarter-mile run rather than simply connecting engine to transmission all at once. The forces acting on this assembly during a run were staggering. It had to manage the transition from engine spinning freely to driving the rear wheels with thousands of pounds of torque, all while the driver was trying to put the power down without spinning the tires into oblivion. These clutches operated under thermal and mechanical stresses that pushed materials science to its absolute limits. And they did this in a bell housing, a protective metal enclosure designed to contain any mechanical failure, that sat approximately 2 feet in front of the driver's legs. When that clutch worked properly, it was an engineering marvel. When it didn't, the results were catastrophic. By 1970, the drag racing community had already documented multiple incidents where clutch assemblies had failed explosively during runs. A clutch disc spinning at several thousand RPM doesn't simply stop when it breaks. The fragments become high-velocity projectiles moving outward from the center of rotation with kinetic energy proportional to the square of their velocity. The bell housing was supposed to contain these fragments. The problem was that the bell housings of the era were frequently overwhelmed by the energy involved in a high RPM clutch failure. Pieces would punch through the housing and travel in whatever direction physics dictated, which in a front-engine dragster often meant forward and sideways, directly toward the driver's legs and feet. The sport knew this was happening. There had been injuries. There had been deaths. The conventional response was to make the clutch components stronger, to make the bell housing thicker, to keep engineering within the existing design framework rather than questioning the framework itself. Don Garlit had won his first major race in 1955, which means by 1970 he had been competing at the highest levels of drag racing for 15 years. That is a long time to spend around any dangerous machinery, but it's an especially long time to spend around nitromethane-burning engines that occasionally tried to kill you. He had seen the sport evolve from rough and improvised to something approaching professional legitimacy. He had watched the power numbers climb year after year, had felt the cars get faster beneath him with every season, and had accumulated the kind of intuitive mechanical understanding that only comes from thousands of hours of actually building, tuning, and driving these machines yourself. He wasn't just a driver who showed up and strapped in. He was an engineer who happened to also be extraordinarily talented at piloting the things he built. That combination, the hands-on technical knowledge combined with the driver's feel for what a car was doing, made him arguably the most complete figure the sport had ever produced. His nickname, Big Daddy, wasn't just affectionate. It reflected a genuine status within the drag racing community. When Garlit had an opinion about chassis setup or fuel mixture or clutch adjustment, people listened, because his opinions were usually right and backed by a track record that nobody else could match. He had been the first driver to exceed 200 miles per hour in a quarter-mile run, a milestone that had seemed almost science fiction when people first started talking about it. He had won championships and set records across 2 decades of competition. His cars, all named in the Swamp Rat series going back to Swamp Rat 1 in 1961, were recognized as among the most carefully engineered machines in the sport. The name came from his Florida roots, a nod to the swampy terrain of his home state that somehow perfectly captured the slightly wild, definitely dangerous character of what he was building. His car in early 1970 was Swamp Rat 13, sponsored by Wynn's Automotive Products, and called the Wynn's Charger. It was a state-of-the-art front-engine top-fuel dragster representing everything the sport had learned about how to make a car go as fast as possible in a straight line. Supercharged Hemi engine, nitromethane fuel, a finely tuned clutch assembly, and a chassis that Garlit himself had been involved in designing and refining. By the standards of the day, it was essentially perfect. Which makes what happened on March 8, 1970, at Lyons Drag Strip in Long Beach, California, all the more striking, because it wasn't a poorly prepared car that failed. It was the best car in the sport, driven by the best driver in the sport, and it still nearly killed him. Lyons Drag Strip was one of the premier venues on the NHRA circuit in that era. Located in the Los Angeles area, it drew the top competitors from across the country and consistently produced some of the fastest times being run anywhere in the world. The Lyons Drag Classic was exactly the kind of event where you'd expect to find Garlit. He had made several passes already that day, and by all accounts the Wynn's Charger was running well. Nothing in the car's behavior during those earlier runs suggested anything unusual was about to happen. This is actually one of the most unsettling aspects of catastrophic mechanical failure in motorsport. It frequently arrives without warning, not as the end point of a gradual degradation that a skilled driver or crew can detect and address, but as a sudden transition from normal to catastrophic with essentially no intermediate stage. Garlit lined up against Richard Tharp for what was supposed to be another competitive run. The Christmas tree countdown sequence ran its lights from amber to green. Garlit engaged the clutch and the Wynn's Charger launched hard off the line. And then, in a fraction of a second that would define the rest of his life, the clutch assembly let go. The word explosion gets used casually in motorsport commentary, but what happened to Swamp Rat 13 on that track wasn't metaphorical. The clutch disintegrated under forces it could no longer contain, and the energy released by that failure was sufficient to physically cut the chassis of the car in half. Not bend it, not crack it, but sever it. The front section of the car, with the engine still running and fuel still burning, continued down the track on its own trajectory. The rear section, with Don Garlit strapped into the driver's position, came to rest on the racing surface. Think about what that actually means for a moment. The structural members of a purpose-built racing chassis, aluminum tubing designed specifically to withstand the loads of high-speed racing, were cut through by the energy released from a mechanical component failure. The bell housing, the containment device that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of collateral damage, had been overwhelmed. Fragments had traveled outward and downward and into the cockpit area with enough velocity to cause devastating injury. Garlit's right foot bore the worst of it. Part of the foot was simply gone, removed by the debris field from the explosion. He also suffered burns and additional trauma from the incident. Emergency crews reached him quickly because Lyons had a professional safety response team on site, but the scene they encountered was severe by any measure, including the standards of a sport that had already seen more than its share of serious accidents. Here is what most people don't realize about that moment in drag racing history. This was not an unprecedented type of accident. Clutch explosions had happened before at lower magnitudes. The engineering community around the sport was aware that the combination of increasing power levels and the fundamental geometry of front-engine cars created a risk profile that was genuinely difficult to manage within the existing design framework. But there is a difference between awareness of a systemic risk and the willingness to fundamentally rethink the system that creates it. The drag racing world in 1970 was deeply committed to the front-engine design. Not out of ignorance, but out of the accumulated investment of decades of development. Every piece of knowledge about how to make a top-fuel dragster fast was encoded around that configuration. Abandoning it meant abandoning the knowledge base, starting over, accepting a period of being slower and less competitive while the new approach was developed. Most organizations, most sports, most industries respond to systemic risk this way. They incrementally improve within the existing framework because the switching costs of fundamental redesign are enormous. They make the bell housing a little thicker, the clutch components a little stronger, the safety equipment a little better, all while leaving the core architecture intact. And often this approach is correct, because incremental improvement really does reduce risk, and the disruption of wholesale redesign carries its own costs and dangers. The problem is that sometimes the fundamental architecture is itself the source of the risk, and no amount of incremental improvement will fix a structural flaw. Garlit understood this. He understood it before the accident at some level, but the accident made it impossible to ignore. While he was in the hospital recovering from surgery, with time to do nothing but think, he started working through the logic of it with the systematic, analytical mind that had made him such an effective engineer throughout his career. The argument for a rear-engine design wasn't new. Various people had proposed it, and a handful of experimental cars had been built with the engine behind the driver over the years. But none of those experiments had been pursued with sufficient resources, expertise, and competitive commitment to actually demonstrate whether the concept could work at the top level. They had been curiosities, interesting ideas that never quite got the development attention needed to prove themselves. The conventional wisdom had hardened around the conclusion that rear-engine cars couldn't handle the power, couldn't be driven consistently, would wheelie uncontrollably because the weight balance was too far rearward, and simply weren't competitive with properly developed front-engine machines. This conventional wisdom was repeated often enough and by credible enough people that it had essentially become received truth within the sport. Garlit, lying in that hospital bed with his rebuilt foot wrapped in bandages, looked at that received truth and decided it was wrong. Not based on new data, not based on some breakthrough insight that nobody had ever considered before, but based on the simple observation that nobody had really tried to prove it wrong. The experimental rear-engine cars had been built by people who were hedging their bets, who weren't willing to fully commit to the new design and develop it with the same intensity they brought to their front-engine programs. Garlit decided he was going to be different. He was going to build a rear-engine top-fuel dragster with the same systematic rigor he had applied to every swamp rat before it, and he was going to find out once and for all whether the conventional wisdom was right, or whether it was just comfortable. The 1971 NHRA Winter Nationals at Pomona, California, is one of those events that drag racing historians return to again and again, not just because of what happened on the track, but because of what it represented for the future of the sport. The Winter Nationals was and remains one of the most prestigious events on the NHRA calendar, the kind of race where the entire professional drag racing community shows up, where the competition is at its absolute sharpest, and where a win means something beyond just the trophy and the prize money. It means you've beaten the best under the most scrutiny, with everyone watching. When Don Garlit drove Swamp Rat 14 to victory at the 1971 Winter Nationals, he didn't just win a race. He answered the question that everyone had been arguing about since the car first appeared. Could a rear-engine top-fuel dragster compete at the highest level? The answer, delivered in the most unambiguous terms possible, was yes. The significance of that win rippled through the drag racing community in the weeks and months that followed in ways that are genuinely interesting to trace. Before Pomona, the skeptics had a reasonable position. The car was new, still being developed, and hadn't yet proven itself against the best competition under championship conditions. After Pomona, that position was no longer reasonable. Garlit hadn't squeaked through on a technicality or won because the competition had mechanical problems. He had run competitive times and beaten front-engine cars driven by skilled, experienced competitors who were trying their hardest to beat him. The performance case for the rear-engine design was now established fact rather than theoretical argument. What happened next in the sport followed a pattern that economists and historians of technology would recognize immediately, even if drag racing fans might not think of it in those terms. The adoption of a genuinely superior technology in a competitive environment tends to follow a specific trajectory. First, there is a period of resistance and skepticism while the new approach is being developed and before it has clearly demonstrated its superiority. Then there is a tipping point, usually a high-profile competitive success, after which the calculation changes for everyone watching. Then there is rapid adoption as competitors realize that continuing with the old approach puts them at a systematic disadvantage. And finally, there is the disappearance of the old technology as even the most committed holdouts accept that the transition is necessary. In drag racing after the 1971 Winter Nationals, this process happened with remarkable speed. Within the 1971 season itself, several other top-fuel teams began experimenting with rear-engine configurations. They weren't starting from scratch the way Garlit had, because Swamp Rat 14 itself provided a working reference point. You could look at how it was built, measure the geometry, study the weight distribution, and use that information to inform your own design. Garlit was generous with information in ways that might surprise people who think of motorsport as a world of jealously guarded secrets. partly because he genuinely believed the safety argument outweighed the competitive advantage of keeping the design proprietary, and partly because he was confident enough in his own ability to keep developing and improving that he wasn't worried about others catching up. By 1972, rear-engine cars were winning races with enough consistency that the competitive argument for staying with front-engine designs was becoming difficult to sustain. By 1973, the transition was well advanced. By the mid-1970s, according to NHRA competition records, front-engine top-fuel dragsters had essentially disappeared from professional competition. Not banned, not regulated out of existence, but simply outcompeted to the point where running one was no longer a rational competitive choice. The entire top fuel class, every car, every team, every championship contender, had adopted the configuration that Don Garlits had pioneered from a hospital bed while recovering from the injury it was designed to prevent. Here is what most people don't realize about how complete that transition was. We are not talking about a gradual coexistence where both designs competed alongside each other for years before one slowly gained the upper hand. We are talking about a sport that had used one fundamental design for its entire existence, roughly 2 decades of accumulated practice and knowledge, completely abandoning that design and replacing it with something new within approximately 5 years. In the context of how slowly most engineering traditions change, even under competitive pressure, that is an extraordinarily rapid transition. It speaks to how decisive the performance and safety advantages of the rear-engine design turned out to be once it was properly developed. The safety improvements were documented and measurable. This is where it gets really interesting, because the data on clutch explosions and driver injuries before and after the transition tells a story that is both encouraging and sobering. Clutch explosions did not stop happening when the sport moved to rear-engine cars. The forces involved in top fuel racing are simply too extreme for any clutch assembly to be considered completely reliable, and mechanical failures continued to occur with some regularity as power levels kept climbing through the 1970s and beyond. What changed was the consequence of those failures. A clutch explosion in a rear-engine top-fuel dragster sent debris rearward and outward, away from the driver. The driver was at the front of the car, separated from the clutch by the length of the chassis and protected by the structural members between him and the failure point. Incidents that would have caused catastrophic injury or death in a front-engine car became survivable, often with the driver walking away relatively unharmed. The NHRA's own safety statistics compiled across the transition period showed a meaningful reduction in the severity of driver injuries associated with drivetrain failures. This is exactly the kind of outcome that safety engineers call passive protection, where the system is designed so that when failure occurs, the human inside the system is inherently protected by the geometry and structure, rather than relying on additional protective equipment or the driver's reaction time. Passive protection is almost always more effective than active protection, because it doesn't depend on anything going right. The clutch can explode at the worst possible moment, at maximum RPM under full load, and the driver is still protected because the physics of the situation put the debris field in the wrong direction to reach him. Now, you might be thinking that the NHRA should have simply mandated the rear-engine design earlier, should have required the switch on safety grounds before Garlits' accident made the argument unavoidable. And this is a genuinely interesting question about how regulatory bodies in motorsport should function. The counter-argument, which was actually articulated at the time, is that mandating an unproven design before it had been demonstrated to work competitively might have pushed teams toward a configuration that had safety drawbacks of its own that hadn't yet been discovered through actual racing experience. Motorsport has a long history of safety innovations that created new problems while solving old ones, and the regulator's challenge is always to distinguish between genuinely superior approaches and approaches that simply look better on paper. What actually happened, Garlits demonstrating the design's viability through competitive success and then the market of competition driving adoption, arguably produced a better outcome than early regulation would have. The rear-engine design was thoroughly tested and validated by the time it became universal, which meant the teams adopting it weren't experimenting with an unknown quantity, but following a well-documented path. This is not an argument against safety regulation in motorsport generally. The history of the sport includes too many cases where voluntary adoption of safety improvements was catastrophically slow, where people died waiting for the competitive market to solve a problem that regulation could have addressed immediately. But in this specific case, the combination of Garlits' personal motivation, his engineering competence, and the competitive pressure of professional racing produced a remarkably rapid and effective safety transition. The safety improvements were documented and measurable. This is where it gets really interesting, because the data on clutch explosions and driver injuries before and after the transition tells a story that is both encouraging and sobering. Clutch explosions did not stop happening when the sport moved to rear-engine cars. The forces involved in top fuel racing are simply too extreme for any clutch assembly to be considered completely reliable, and mechanical failures continued to occur with some regularity as power levels kept climbing through the 1970s and beyond. What changed was the consequence of those failures. A clutch explosion in a rear-engine top-fuel dragster sent debris rearward and outward, away from the driver. The driver was at the front of the car, separated from the clutch by the length of the chassis and protected by the structural members between him and the failure point. Incidents that would have caused catastrophic injury or death in a front-engine car became survivable, often with the driver walking away relatively unharmed. The NHRA's own safety statistics compiled across the transition period showed a meaningful reduction in the severity of driver injuries associated with drivetrain failures. This is exactly the kind of outcome that safety engineers call passive protection, where the system is designed so that when failure occurs, the human inside the system is inherently protected by the geometry and structure, rather than relying on additional protective equipment or the driver's reaction time. Passive protection is almost always more effective than active protection, because it doesn't depend on anything going right. The clutch can explode at the worst possible moment, at maximum RPM under full load, and the driver is still protected because the physics of the situation put the debris field in the wrong direction to reach him. Now, you might be thinking that the NHRA should have simply mandated the rear engine design earlier, should have required the switch on safety grounds before Garlits' accident made the argument unavoidable. And this is a genuinely interesting question about how regulatory bodies in motorsport should function. The counter-argument, which was actually articulated at the time, is that mandating an unproven design before it had been demonstrated to work competitively might have pushed teams toward a configuration that had safety drawbacks of its own that hadn't yet been discovered through actual racing experience. Motorsport has a long history of safety innovations that created new problems while solving old ones, and the regulator's challenge is always to distinguish between genuinely superior approaches and approaches that simply look better on paper. What actually happened, Garlit demonstrating the design's viability through competitive success and then the market of competition driving adoption, arguably produced a better outcome than early regulation would have. The rear engine design was thoroughly tested and validated by the time it became universal, which meant the teams adopting it weren't experimenting with an unknown quantity, but following a well-documented path. This is not an argument against safety regulation in motorsport generally. The history of the sport includes too many cases where voluntary adoption of safety improvements was catastrophically slow, where people died waiting for the competitive market to solve a problem that regulation could have addressed immediately. But in this specific case, the combination of Garlits' personal motivation, his engineering competence, and the competitive pressure of professional racing produced a remarkably rapid and effective safety transition. The performance story is equally important and often gets less attention than the safety narrative, possibly because safety improvements feel more morally significant and therefore more worthy of emphasis. But the fact that rear-engine cars turned out to be faster than front-engine cars, not just safer, is actually crucial to understanding why the transition happened as quickly as it did. If the rear-engine design had been meaningfully slower while being safer, the adoption rate would have been much more gradual, because teams would have been choosing between safety and competitiveness rather than getting both simultaneously. The aerodynamic advantages of having a clear, unobstructed front section on the car, the weight distribution benefits for traction, and the improved driver visibility all contributed to performance gains that compounded over time as teams learned to optimize the new configuration. According to elapsed time records maintained by the NHRA across this period, top fuel quarter-mile times improved substantially through the 1970s, continuing a trend that had been ongoing since the sport began. What's interesting is that the rate of improvement, the pace at which records fell, did not slow during the transition to rear-engine cars. If anything, it may have accelerated slightly as teams discovered that the new configuration had performance headroom that the old design had been leaving unexploited. The fastest front-engine top-fuel cars of the early 1970s were running quarter miles in the low 6-second range at speeds around 240 miles per hour. By the late 1970s, with rear-engine cars fully developed and universal, times had dropped further and speeds had climbed. The rear-engine revolution hadn't just made drag racing safer, it had made it faster. Garlit himself kept winning through this period, which is its own remarkable part of the story. He wasn't just the person who invented the new configuration and then watched others exploit it more effectively. He remained one of the top competitors in the sport throughout the 1970s, continuing to develop his Swamp Rat series cars with the same systematic approach that had characterized his entire career. The competitive field was catching up to his design, but he kept moving the design forward, finding new optimizations, incorporating new materials and technologies as they became available. His championship wins in the top fuel class using rear-engine cars added to an already extraordinary record and reinforced the argument that the design transition had been correct in every dimension. What you see in Garlit's career across this period is something genuinely rare in any field. A person who combines the creative insight to see a better way of doing things with the technical competence to actually build it, and the competitive skills to prove it works under pressure. Each of those three qualities is reasonably common in isolation. There are plenty of creative thinkers in motorsport who can't execute their ideas. There are plenty of skilled engineers who can build what they're told, but don't generate novel approaches. There are plenty of fast drivers who have no particular insight into why their car is fast. Finding all three in the same person, operating at the highest level of a demanding professional sport, is exceptional. Finding it in someone who is also recovering from a serious injury while doing it adds another dimension that is difficult to fully articulate. The story of Don Garlit and the rear-engine revolution doesn't end with the competitive validation of Swamp Rat 14, or even with the wholesale adoption of the design across the top fuel class. It continues for more than 2 decades after the accident, through a career that by any reasonable measure should have been over in March of 1970, and it arrives at a moment in 1992 that stands as one of the most remarkable individual achievements in the history of motorsport. But to get there, we need to spend some time understanding what was happening in drag racing through the 1970s and 1980s, because the context matters for appreciating exactly what Garlit accomplished and why it still resonates so deeply with people who care about the history of the sport. Through the mid to late 1970s, top fuel drag racing was in a period of extraordinary development. The rear-engine configuration, now universal across the professional class, was being refined by dozens of teams simultaneously, each contributing their own engineering insights to a collective knowledge base that grew rapidly. Power levels kept climbing as fuel injection technology improved, as supercharger designs became more sophisticated, and as teams developed deeper understanding of how to extract maximum performance from nitromethane combustion. The NHRA periodically introduced regulations designed to manage the pace of development and maintain some relationship between performance and safety margins. But the fundamental trajectory of the sport was toward more power, more speed, and faster elapsed times with every passing season. Garlit was at the center of this development, not just as a competitor, but as someone whose thinking about chassis design and mechanical systems continued to push the boundaries of what was considered possible. His Swamp Rat series cars kept evolving, each iteration incorporating lessons learned from the previous one, each one representing a slightly better answer to the question of how to make a top-fuel dragster go faster. The naming convention he had established in 1961 continued, with each new car carrying the next number in the sequence, creating a documented lineage of development that is itself a remarkable artifact of engineering history. If you visit the Don Garlit Museum of Drag Racing in Ocala, Florida, you can trace that lineage physically, walking past cars that represent 40 years of continuous development by one of the most analytically gifted minds the sport has ever produced. The museum itself is worth a digression, because it tells you something important about how Garlit understood his own place in the history of the sport. He didn't build a shrine to his own victories, though the victories are certainly documented there. He built a comprehensive historical record of drag racing's development, with his own cars serving as primary sources in that history. The original Swamp Rat 14, the car that started the rear-engine revolution, is there. So are many of its predecessors and successors. The collection includes not just Garlits' own machines but artifacts from across the sport's history, because he understood that his story was part of a larger story, and that the larger story deserved to be told completely. This curatorial instinct, the sense that history matters and should be preserved and presented honestly, is itself a reflection of the analytical mindset that made him such an effective engineer and innovator. Back on the track through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Garlit continued to compete at a level that defied both his age and the physical limitations of his injury. Here is something worth understanding about what it actually means to drive a top-fuel dragster with a partially reconstructed foot. The physical demands of the job are extreme in ways that aren't always obvious from watching. The acceleration forces during a top fuel run are roughly equivalent to what a space shuttle crew experiences during launch, somewhere in the range of 4 to 5 times the force of gravity, sustained across a run that lasts between 3 and 4 seconds. Every part of your body is being pushed backward into the seat with enormous force. Your vision narrows under the G-loading. The noise level inside the cockpit, even with hearing protection, is overwhelming. The heat from the engine and exhaust is significant. And through all of this, you are making real-time adjustments to throttle position and managing the car's behavior with inputs that have to be both precise and immediate. Doing all of this with a foot that has been surgically rebuilt after losing a significant portion of its structure requires adaptations that most drivers would find limiting. Garlit found ways to make it work, partly through sheer determination and partly through the kind of practical problem-solving that characterized everything he did. He adjusted his pedal setup, modified his driving technique where necessary, and simply refused to accept that the injury represented a ceiling on what he could achieve. This is not a story about ignoring physical reality. It's a story about understanding physical reality well enough to find routes around it. His competitive record through the 1980s remained strong, though the field had become significantly more sophisticated than it had been in the early 1970s. The teams that had adopted the rear-engine design were now fully expert in its optimization, having spent a decade developing their understanding of the configuration. The advantage that Garlit had held as the pioneer of the design had naturally eroded as the rest of the sport caught up and in some cases pushed development in directions he hadn't anticipated. Top fuel racing by the mid-1980s was genuinely competitive in a way it had never been during the years of Garlit's dominance, with multiple teams capable of winning any given event and no single car or driver holding a systematic advantage across the season. This is actually where the 1992 achievement becomes even more extraordinary, because it didn't happen in a context where Garlit was the dominant force in the sport the way he had been in the 1960s and early 1970s. It happened in a context where he was a veteran competitor in his early 60s, racing against teams with younger drivers, larger budgets, and the full benefit of 2 decades of rear-engine development that his own innovation had enabled. The record he set in 1992 was not the product of superior resources or technological advantage. It was the product of accumulated expertise, precise preparation, and the kind of focused execution under pressure that only comes from decades of experience at the absolute highest level of a demanding sport. On March 20, 1992, at the Gator Nationals in Gainesville, Florida, Don Garlit ran the quarter mile in 4.762 seconds at a speed of 301.70 miles per hour. That speed, 301.70 miles per hour, made him the first driver in history to exceed 300 miles per hour in a quarter-mile run. He was 60 years old. Let that sit for a moment because it deserves to. 60 years old. 22 years after the accident that removed part of his foot and that many people assumed would end his career. The first human being to drive a vehicle through a measured quarter mile at over 300 miles per hour was a 60-year-old man who had been told, implicitly by circumstance and explicitly by some in the sport, that his best days were behind him. The record was set at the Gator Nationals, an event held in his home state of Florida, which added a layer of personal significance to an achievement that was already historic by any objective measure. Here is what most people don't realize about the significance of the 300-mile-per-hour barrier in the context of drag racing history. Speed milestones in motorsport carry a psychological weight that goes beyond the purely physical. Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile didn't just establish a new record. It demonstrated that a barrier people had begun to think of as a human limit was actually just a benchmark waiting to be surpassed. When Garlits broke 200 miles per hour decades earlier, it had a similar effect on how the drag racing community thought about what was possible. The 300-mile-per-hour barrier had been approaching for years as elapsed times dropped and terminal speeds climbed. But there is a difference between approaching a round number and actually crossing it. Garlits crossed it first, at 60. After everything. The reaction within the drag racing community was a mixture of celebration and something approaching awe, which is not an emotion that hardened professional motorsport people express easily or often. These were people who had spent their careers around extraordinary performances, who had seen records fall regularly and had developed a certain professional detachment about individual achievements. But even within that culture of understatement and pragmatism, what Garlits had done at Gainesville in 1992 produced genuine emotional responses. Not just because of the speed, but because of the arc of the story that led to it. The man who had nearly been killed by his sport, who had used his recovery to reinvent his sport, who had competed through injury and age and the natural erosion of the advantages he had pioneered, had finished the job by setting the most significant speed record in the sport's history at an age when most athletes have been retired for decades. The 300-mile-per-hour run also served as a kind of punctuation mark on the rear-engine revolution, in a way that is satisfying from a narrative standpoint, even if it wasn't consciously designed that way. The design that Garlits had invented to make drag racing safer had also, through the combination of his own development work and the contributions of every team that adopted and improved it, produced a car capable of 300 miles per hour in a quarter mile. The safety and the performance had gone together from the beginning, and the 300-mile-per-hour barrier was the most dramatic possible demonstration of how far the performance had come. Every one of those 301 miles per hour had been generated by a rear-engine car. The front-engine machines that the old guard had defended so vigorously were not just obsolete by 1992. They were so far behind the state-of-the-art that they existed only in museums, including Garlits' own museum in Ocala. The competitive career wound down gradually after the 1992 record, as careers at that level tend to do. Garlits continued to make appearances and occasional competitive runs into the mid-1990s, but the 300-mile-per-hour mark at Gainesville represented a natural endpoint, a final statement so definitive that anything after it would inevitably feel like an epilogue rather than a continuation of the main story. He transitioned into the role he occupies today, which is that of the sport's most important living historian and the acknowledged patriarch of modern drag racing's fundamental design philosophy. The museum in Ocala became a more central focus of his energy, growing into one of the most comprehensive collections of drag racing history in existence. What the legacy of Don Garlits looks like from a distance of more than 50 years is actually quite straightforward to articulate, even if living through it and making it happen was anything but straightforward. Every top-fuel dragster that races today, every funny car, every pro-modified machine that uses the rear-engine configuration, traces its lineage directly to the decision that Garlits made in a hospital bed in 1970. The safety record of modern top fuel racing, which has improved dramatically from the dangerous early days despite power levels that would have seemed impossible to the sport's pioneers, owes a direct and specific debt to that decision. The 300-mile-per-hour barrier, now routinely exceeded by modern top fuel cars, was first crossed by the man who made crossing it possible through the engineering revolution he started. There is a particular kind of legacy in motorsport that goes beyond championship wins and speed records, beyond the trophies and the photographs and the carefully preserved cars in museum collections. It is the legacy of someone who changed not just how fast a sport could go, but how the sport thought about itself, what it was willing to accept, what it refused to tolerate, and what it believed was possible. Don Garlit occupies that category in a way that very few figures in any sport ever have. And understanding why requires stepping back from the specific details of clutch explosions and elapsed times and looking at the broader pattern of what his career actually represents. The drag racing world that existed before March 8, 1970, operated under a set of assumptions that were so deeply embedded in the culture of the sport that most people inside it couldn't see them clearly enough to question them. One of those assumptions was that a certain level of catastrophic mechanical risk was simply the price of going fast, that the forces involved in top fuel racing were so extreme that some percentage of runs would end in violent failure, and that the best you could do was build stronger components and hope the containment systems held. Another assumption was that the front engine configuration, having produced the fastest cars and the most championship wins over 2 decades of development, represented something close to the optimal solution to the problem of making a dragster go fast. These assumptions weren't stupid. They were based on real experience and real data. They were also wrong, or at least incomplete, in ways that became apparent only when someone was motivated enough and capable enough to challenge them directly. What Garlit did by building Swamp Rat 14 was not just solve an engineering problem. He demonstrated that the assumptions themselves were questionable, that the received wisdom of an entire sport could be wrong in ways that had real consequences for the people inside it. This is a much harder thing to do than simply building a faster car, because it requires first convincing yourself that the conventional wisdom is wrong, which means overcoming your own investment in the existing approach, and then convincing everyone else, which means withstanding the social pressure of a community that has organized itself around the ideas you're challenging. Garlit did both of these things, and the fact that he was motivated by a personal catastrophe rather than abstract engineering curiosity doesn't diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes it more human and more relatable. Look, the broader lesson here extends well beyond drag racing, and I think it's worth making explicit because it's the reason stories like this one matter beyond their entertainment value. Every field of human endeavor, every sport, every industry, every professional discipline, accumulates conventional wisdom over time. That wisdom is valuable because it represents the distilled learning of everyone who has worked in the field before you, the hard-won understanding of what works and what doesn't, encoded in practices and designs and cultural norms that get passed down from one generation of practitioners to the next. Respecting that accumulated knowledge is generally the right approach, because most of the time the conventional wisdom is conventional for good reasons. But conventional wisdom has a shadow side. It tends to calcify around the solutions that were available when the problems were first encountered, even when better solutions have since become possible. It tends to be self-reinforcing, because the people who have invested the most in understanding the existing approach are also the people with the most social authority to defend it. And it tends to be invisible to the people inside it, which is perhaps the most dangerous characteristic of all. You can't question an assumption you can't see. The accident at Lyons Drag Strip in March 1970 was, among other things, a moment of forced visibility. It made the assumptions of front-engine drag racing impossible to ignore, at least for the man lying in the hospital bed thinking about what had just happened to him. Here is what most people don't realize about the mechanics of innovation in dangerous sports. The safety improvements and the performance improvements are almost always connected, not accidentally, but structurally. When you are forced to fundamentally rethink a design for safety reasons, you inevitably discover performance opportunities that the old design was obscuring. The front-engine dragster had been optimized to within a very small margin of its theoretical maximum by 1970. 2 decades of development by hundreds of talented engineers and drivers had explored most of the available design space within that configuration. The rear engine design opened up an entirely new design space, one with much more unexplored territory and therefore much more room for performance improvement. The 300 miles per hour that Garlit achieved in 1992 wasn't just the product of better engines and better fuel. It was the product of a fundamentally superior platform that the old configuration could never have supported regardless of how much development it received. This pattern appears throughout motorsport history with enough consistency that it's worth treating as something close to a principle. The most significant performance breakthroughs have frequently come from safety-driven redesigns that forced engineers to question assumptions they had previously taken for granted. The monocoque chassis that Colin Chapman developed for Formula One in the early 1960s, partly motivated by the inadequacy of existing structures in crash situations, produced cars that were both safer and faster than the space frame designs they replaced. The ground effect aerodynamics that revolutionized Formula One in the late 1970s emerged from a systematic rethinking of how cars interacted with the air around them that was partly driven by the desire to generate downforce without the drag penalty of large wings, which were themselves a safety concern at high speeds. The carbon fiber monocoque that McLaren introduced in 1981, directly motivated by the catastrophic injuries that space frame chassis were producing in serious accidents, became the foundation of modern Formula One car construction and produced structures both lighter and stronger than anything that had come before. Garlit's rear-engine revolution fits this pattern precisely. The safety argument drove the initial decision to pursue the design. The performance advantages emerged from the development process that followed. The combination of safety and performance made adoption inevitable once the design had been validated competitively. And the sport that emerged from the transition was genuinely better in every measurable dimension than the sport that had existed before. Faster, safer, more technically sophisticated, and more capable of continuing to develop because the new design had more unexplored potential than the old one had left. I want to address something directly here because it comes up whenever this story is discussed seriously, which is the question of whether Garlit deserves sole credit for the rear-engine revolution, or whether he was primarily the person who popularized an idea whose time had come regardless of what any individual did. This is actually an important question, and it deserves a straight answer. The honest answer is that both things are true, and they don't contradict each other. The rear-engine concept had been explored before Garlit built Swamp Rat 14. Other people had thought about it, discussed it, and built experimental versions of it with varying degrees of seriousness. In that sense, the idea was available before Garlit acted on it, and it's plausible that someone else might eventually have pursued it with sufficient commitment to demonstrate its viability. But here is the thing about ideas in competitive environments. An idea that is available but unproven is not the same as an idea that has been demonstrated to work at the highest level. The gap between those two states is enormous, and crossing it requires exactly the combination of qualities that Garlit brought to the problem. The technical knowledge to design a car that could actually compete, the driving skill to extract maximum performance from an unfamiliar configuration during the development process, the competitive credibility to make the rest of the sport take the results seriously, rather than dismissing them as a curiosity, and the personal motivation, in this case supplied with brutal effectiveness by the accident itself, to pursue the project with sufficient intensity and commitment to actually complete it. Without all of those elements present simultaneously, the rear-engine design might have remained an interesting concept, rather than becoming the universal standard of the sport. The question of individual credit in technological transitions is always somewhat artificial, because technologies don't develop in isolation, and the people who make decisive contributions are always building on the work of everyone who came before them. But there is a meaningful difference between contributing to a gradual evolution and being the person who crosses the threshold that makes further development inevitable for everyone else. Garlit crossed that threshold. The 1971 Winter Nationals win was the threshold. Before it, rear-engine cars were an interesting experiment. After it, they were the future of the sport. That before and after distinction is real, and the person who created it deserves the credit that history has correctly assigned. The man himself, Don Garlit, now well into his 90s as this is recorded, has spoken in various interviews over the decades about how he thinks about the accident and what followed. His perspective is characteristically direct and unsentimental. He doesn't describe the hospital bed revelation as a moment of inspiration or frame the subsequent development of Swamp Rat 14 as a heroic personal journey. He talks about it the way an engineer talks about solving a problem, identifying what went wrong, analyzing the fundamental cause, developing a solution that addressed the root issue rather than the symptoms, and testing the solution under real conditions until it was validated. The emotional dimension of the story, the injury and the recovery and the determination to return to competition, is real and is part of the record, but Garlit himself tends to subordinate it to the technical narrative, which is, in its own way, the most revealing thing about how he thinks. This is where it gets really interesting from the perspective of what we choose to celebrate in motorsport. The popular narrative around Garlit focuses heavily on the personal drama, the accident, the injury, the comeback, the 300-mile-per-hour record at 60 years old. These are genuinely compelling elements of a remarkable story, and they deserve the attention they receive. But the part of the story that matters most in terms of actual impact on the sport and on the lives of the people in it is the engineering decision. The choice to fundamentally rethink the design of a top-fuel dragster based on a clear analysis of why the existing design was inadequate. That decision, made by one person using knowledge and analytical tools that other people in the sport also possessed, changed the risk profile of the sport permanently. It is almost certainly responsible for saving multiple lives over the decades since 1970. Lives that would have been lost to clutch explosions in front-engine cars if the transition to rear-engine design had happened more slowly or not at all. The Don Garlit Museum of Drag Racing in Ocala, Florida, is the right place to end this story, because it is where the physical evidence of everything we have discussed in this video is preserved and presented. Walking through that museum, you can see the actual cars, from the early Swamp Rats in their front-engine configuration through Swamp Rat 14 and the subsequent rear-engine cars through the car that broke 300 miles per hour in 1992. You can see the evolution of the design in physical form, the specific changes in geometry and layout and construction that represent the accumulated learning of 40 years of development. You can see the bell housings and clutch components that failed, and the ones that held. You can see the safety equipment that evolved alongside the mechanical systems as the sport learned, sometimes at great cost, what it needed to protect its drivers. And if you go, and you really should go if you have any interest in motorsport history, you will understand something about Don Garlit that the highlight reel version of his story doesn't fully convey. He was not just a great driver, not just a successful competitor, not just a record setter. He was someone who understood, at a genuinely deep level, that the sport he loved was capable of being better than it was, and who had the knowledge, the skill, the credibility, and ultimately the personal motivation to make it better. The rear-engine revolution wasn't a happy accident or a lucky insight. It was the product of everything Don Garlit had learned across 20 years of building and racing and winning, and occasionally nearly dying, applied with complete commitment to solving a problem that the sport had been avoiding because solving it was hard and uncomfortable, and required admitting that the old way was wrong. That is the story of Big Daddy and the revolution he started from a hospital bed in 1970. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and drop a comment letting me know whether you had heard of Don Garlit before today, because the answer to that question tells me something useful about where to take this channel next. And if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of deep dive into motorsport history, share it with them. These stories deserve to be told, and they deserve to be heard. We will see you next time.